Hello, and here is what's probably the last video for your VCE course, and it's on stress and health. Going to go through this quick. I don't want this to go for too long, so let's dive right in. So, stress, what is it? You're in the middle of possibly one of the most stressful times of your life, possibly, hopefully. This is as stressful as it gets for you. But stress is a state of physiological and psychological arousal produced by internal or external stresses perceived by the individual as challenging and unable to cope with. Okay, so that's a lot of things to break down there, but that's really important that we understand this. Stress isn't necessarily bad. You're going to find that out a little bit later. But it is the physiological and psychological arousal. Okay, so that's really important. There are internal and external stresses. We're going to find out what a stressor is in the next slide. Okay, and it's important to understand that it's all of these things perceived by the individual as either challenging or unable to cope with. Okay, so it's about the perception of the individual. What is stressful for someone might not be stressful for someone else. We've seen that in our class a lot. So what is a stressor? Well, it's a person, situation, or event that causes stress, simply enough. There can be physical stresses, such as the temperature or your temperature. And there can also be psychological stresses like running late or an upcoming exam. There are internal stresses that come from inside the individual, like your personal problems, issues you're dealing with. Then there are external stresses, once again, like those exams that are coming up that you should be studying for. So, when stress or a stressor enters our environment, there are different ways in which we respond. We have physiological and we have psychological responses to stress. Okay, now the physiological, like physio, is the body, and psychological, of course, is the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So, the stress response is how our body and how our mind change so that we can confront the stressor. Okay? Now, there is mild stress, which can sometimes be stimulating, exhilarating, motivating, and challenging, like having to meet some sort of personal challenge or meet a deadline for an assignment. There is acute stress, which suddenly produces high arousal levels and can result in short-term physiological or psychological responses, like having to cram study the period before a SAC, that kind of idea. And there's chronic stress, which produces high arousal levels for an extended period of time and can result in long-term psychological and physiological responses. So this is if you live in a dangerous building. This is if you have a crazy neighbor. This is if you live in an environment where perhaps you are the only one here and all the other family members are in a dangerous country somewhere else. Something like that. Prolonged long-term stress. So what are our responses? Well, let's look at the physiological. We have the fight-flight response. You should remember this from Unit 3. The fight-flight response is an involuntary reaction resulting in a state of physiological readiness to deal with a sudden threat by either confronting it or running away from it. So you either meet it and fight it, like our little caveman down there, or you go, too hard, I'm running away from it. Basically, the fight-flight response, as you need to know it in the short term, so the immediate fight-flight response is from the autonomic nervous system and the endocrine system. The sympathetic nervous system inspires arousal in the body. Okay? Heart rate, blood flow, respiration, glucose levels, pupil dilation, and adrenaline all increase. Okay? So you're ready to fight, you're ready to flight. Then we have the parasympathetic nervous system, which calms you down and keeps you at a stable level. Okay, I've talked about digestion there. When you are fired up, you're not hungry. After you've had a big stressful event, then usually you get pretty hungry afterwards. So then this leads us to the next thing. What you need to remember is the fight-flight is in the immediate. It's in the first couple of minutes, couple of hours. Okay? But then, after that stressor has been met by our body's response, if it still stays there, the fight-flight response, okay, the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system can't sustain that unless it changes the tools that it uses. That brings us to the HPA axis. We've looked at this a lot, okay? And it's called the HPA axis because, as you can see there, the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the adrenal glands. Okay, so when the threat is prolonged, the hypothalamus is activated and reactivated, and reactivated and reactivated. Basically, the hypothalamus then activates the pituitary gland. Okay, so once the pituitary gland is activated, it releases something called ACTH. I don't expect you to pronounce that other word. Adenoprothetic, who cares what that is? ACTH. Okay, it's a hormone. And what ACTH does is it travels through the bloodstream and it starts to activate other systems like your adrenal glands, your adrenal medulla. Okay, and that sits just above the kidneys. And then what that does in turn eventually is it activates and releases cortisol. So in the fight-flight response, the adrenal glands release adrenaline and noradrenaline, whereas in the HPA axis, the adrenal glands are responsible for the release of cortisol. You can see that here in this diagram. Okay, so if we look down, immediate stress, so let's say the dog, love the old dog example, the dog crosses your path in an alley, just you, just the dog, it's night, you're not sure what to do, your hypothalamus, your brain kicks in, your hypothalamus kicks in, and it goes straight across here to the fight and flight response. Sympathetic nervous system is activated, the adrenal medulla is activated, okay, and the adrenaline and noradrenaline are activated. Okay, that's the stress hormone. That means you get an increase in energy, an increase in arousal. If the dog isn't just from the street, it is also living next door to you and there's a hole in the fence and you're not sure you can go outside your house at any time without it attacking you, then that is a constant stressor, which means that another system kicks in. On the right here you see the HPA axis. So the hypothalamus is activated again, it activates the pituitary gland and ACTH, which then activates the adrenal cortex, which then activates cortisol or releases cortisol, the stress hormone, to keep you in a heightened state of arousal. So, with the fight and flight, adrenal glands release adrenaline and noradrenaline, and when the HPA axis kicks in, they release cortisol. Okay? Basically what you need to know here is that adrenaline increases your oxygen availability for muscles and cortisol increases your metabolism and glucose for fuel. Both of these things are just different ways of burning energy. The PE students should know this. Okay? The other thing we need to know is cortisol and noradrenaline in high concentrations for prolonged time can decrease immune function. It can make you sick. If you have these systems on for too long, you get sick, you get tired, your body starts to attack itself. All right? The fight-flight response is adaptive and it ensures survival when threatened. And the side effects are dizziness, skin rashes, heart palpitations, fatigue, headaches, and unwell. That's if you have those noradrenaline and cortisol in your system for too long. This brings us to eustress and de-stress. So once those systems we were talking about kick in, it has certain effects on your body, all right? But some of them can be good. So some stress can be good for us. Sometimes it can drive us to excel. I know myself, I'm a bit of a deadline warrior, okay? I really can't get stuff done unless it's due in the next couple of days, and that really motivates me to get stuff done. For me, that's eustress, okay? It raises our alertness, it raises our arousal. Some of you that cram live in this same zone, okay? Eustress is positive psychological response to a stressor. For example, enthusiasm, excitement, being active, being alert. Sport is one of these things. Riding a roller coaster, you guys that went to Luna Park the other day, that's another example of eustress. It fires you up, but it doesn't make you feel sick, it doesn't make you feel bad, it makes you feel quite pumped up. Okay? Distress is a negative psychological response to a stressor. And this could manifest itself in anxiety, nervousness, irritability, tension, those kinds of things. Here's a simple little diagram that you can look at. A stressor comes into our environment, okay? and then we have stress. Now the stress is not necessarily specific yet, we don't know whether it's good or bad. What happens is our body then has to decide, our brain has to decide, is this stress eustress or distress? If it decides eustress, you can see it going up there. It's a short-term thing. We get alertness, excitement, we're energized, we're motivated. Sometimes we get euphoria, okay? And it's a positive experience. If during the cognitive appraisal, which is basically decision, is it eustress or distress? If it's determined to be distress, that can be short-term or long-term, okay? And it can be the producer of negativity, damage our health, increase in anxiety, reduce our coping strategies, and it can be upsetting for us, all right? So, they were the physiological. Now what are the psychological responses? Well, there's a few. We can have behavioral changes. So, for example, stress comes up, some people get a certain look on their face, they get a shaky voice, hand tremors, muscle stiffness, jumpiness. Just imagine you have to give a presentation in front of the whole school. For some people, that's no drama. For other people, I'm sure you would get some of these things. Sometimes you get emotional changes. You might know yourself, if there's a massive stress on you, you're quicker to be angry, you're tense. Some people retreat into themselves and don't leave the house. They become very quiet, very irritable, short-tempered, those kinds of things. Other people, sometimes we also see cognitive changes where your perception is distorted. You know, that kind of, oh, well, it doesn't matter, I can't do anything anyway, I'm useless. What's the point in even trying? That kind of idea. Your concentration decreases when you're under stress. Your decision making is poor. Sometimes you forget things, usually because you're not attending to them. And sometimes you have illogical thoughts. You know, so things like, you know, maybe I just won't study for math methods because I'm going to fail that anyway, so I'm completely ignore that exam and just try to do really well on my other four. Not really a good strategy, and probably best to try your best in all of your subjects. Sometimes in cognitive changes we see this idea of catastrophizing, which is where we dwell on the potential consequences of the negative events. Things like, if you do bad in a SAC, that's it, my life's over, I'm never going to be what I want to be, I might as well jump off the Westgate Bridge now. Please don't ever do that. But that idea, okay, if you get a bad SAC mark, that means that your whole VCE and schooling career has been wasted, or if you don't do so well on your exams, okay, don't dwell on those potential consequences. But that's what catastrophizing is. So, about to lead into a theory about stress and how we deal with stress, but there's lots of things that can determine how you respond to stress. You might remember the activity we did where I called out a whole bunch of little things that might be stresses, and you had to go different parts of the room for if you were really stressed out and if you weren't stressed out. There was one person in our class who most of the time didn't see a lot of the things that I was talking about as stresses. And there might be a reason for that, there might not be. But some of the things that can determine whether you freak out a lot or whether you stay pretty constant could be due to prior experience, motivation, your self-esteem levels, your attitude or outlook on life, your personality, your coping skills, and your perception of control, how much control you have over a situation. We know this kind of stuff from Lazarus and Folkman's Transactional Model of Stress Coping. Blah, 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 blah. Big name, but relatively simple idea. We're going to talk through this. The diagram I'm going to show you in a minute makes the most sense. But they believe that stress involves an encounter between the individual and the external environment. Stress response depends on individuals' interpretation of a stressor and their ability to cope. It's like a maths equation. So the stress depends on the individual's interpretation of a stressor and their ability to cope. So stress is in the eye of the beholder. So what happens is stressor enters your environment and there is the primary appraisal or the first judgment that you have to make. Judgment number one is judge the significance of the situation. Is it irrelevant? Is it benign or positive, meaning, I don't know, kind of okay? Or is it stressful? Okay? If we decide the situation at this point is stressful, Then we have to go into another appraisal. Is the stress harmful? Okay, so what damage can be done? Is it threatening? So what damage might be done? Okay, or is it a challenge? Is there potential gain here? Can I get something out of this? You then have to make a secondary appraisal, which is evaluating your coping options and resources. All right, and I'll give you an example when you get the diagram in front of you. Eventually, once you get to this stage, you make a reappraisal. You go back. Can this stressor that I decided was stressful, if I look at the ways I cope with it, is it still as stressful as I first thought? That's the reappraisal. The coping mechanisms that they come up with is coping in general is a change in cognitive and behavioral effort to manage stresses appraised as exceeding the resources of the person. All right, so first of all, there's a dog. I'm scared. That's a stressor. Okay, but can I deal with this? Well, the dog is on the lead and the owner looks like he has control of the dog, therefore it's okay. Okay, so that would be coping. That means that then the resources that I have don't outweigh the stress that's coming my way. I can do problem-focused coping, which is where I manage the source of the problem. So sometimes, for example, you get your first sack back, right? And it says you got a C. You go to your teacher, and so instead of saying, I'm dumb, I give up, okay, you then go to your teacher and say, okay, so what do I need to work on for next time? And they say work on A, B, and C, and you say, beautiful. You go back and work on it, and therefore the next time you have a sack, it won't be so stressful because you know you've worked on the things you need to improve on. And then you have emotional focused coping, right? And there are different ways that people deal with their emotion focused coping. First one is denial. It's not a stress, it's not a worry, it doesn't bother me. It doesn't bother me at all. I'm not even thinking about it. Sure you're not. Then there's avoidance. This is stupid, I'm not doing it. Okay. Then we have wishful thinking. Well, maybe, hopefully lucky, if I just win the lottery, it won't matter that I don't have a job. Then you have acceptance, and sometimes you have venting, which is where people get a bit angry and snap a little bit. Sometimes you can also find yourself believing that you don't have control over the situation, and sometimes that alleviates people's stress. There's nothing I can do here. This is just how it's going to be. I just have to write it out. A quick example. First of all, let's go with the English exam. English exam coming up. Big stressor. Primary appraisal. Let's sort it out. So, is it a stress? Is it a stress? Is it not a stress? Some people would think it's irrelevant because they're not sitting the English exam, maybe. I don't care about the English exam. You do. Some people think it's benign positive. They love English. English is their best subject. So it's not stressful for them. They've got it. They've done the study all over the holidays. They're ready to go. Other people struggle with the English exam. They just don't get it. They don't know how to write about context, and therefore it's stressful. So then they look at it, okay? And they say, all right, is it harmful? Am I going to lose anything? Well, it's not harmful. You haven't lost anything yet. Is it a threat? Well, if I bomb out, then perhaps it could affect my ATAR score. So it could be a threat. Other people see it as a challenge. You know what? I'm going to nail it. I studied hard. It's still full on for me, but I'm going to do my best and see how I go. So, and then we have that secondary appraisal. Can they do anything about it? Well, some people will study hard. Some people will give up. Some people will try and avoid it. A whole bunch of things. Okay? Most people, I'm hoping, will go down to the coping resources are greater than the demand, and that's where they've worked on the problem-focused coping of I've studied, I've talked to my English teacher, I know what I'm doing, I just have to go in there and do it. Okay? Some people will go to the other way, where they don't feel they have the resources because they haven't paid attention in class, they haven't spoken to their teacher, their friends are talking about stuff in English that they have no idea about because they've missed so many classes, and now they're in a stressful place. Okay? So, the strengths and weaknesses of their model. Focuses on psychological determinants of the stress response, not necessarily the physiological. It highlights a person's active role in the stress response. You have a large amount of control over what you stress out about. Okay? It helps explain why people respond differently to the same stressor. And of course, it accounts for changes in stress a situation over time and proposes different methods for managing the psychological responses. The limitations. This is hard to nail down in research. We can't prove this or disprove this really 100%. That's an issue. Individuals' responses are complex and subjective, which makes it hard. Also, debate over the need to appraise so many times. There's still some debate going on over that. Okay. Also, primary and secondary appraisals often happen simultaneously, making it difficult to figure out which one's which.